On Sunday morning, Dr. George Nichols conducted Shanda's autopsy. The procedure revealed that she'd suffered multiple injuries. Ligature marks were found on her wrists, and she had several lacerations on her head, neck, and legs. Shanda's fingers were in such distorted condition that they had to be cut off in order to take prints. Her jaw was also removed so that her dentist could make a positive identification. The upper part of the body was covered in 3rd and 4th degree burns, and her tongue protruded through clenched teeth. Lacerations to the anus and rectum indicated a blunt object had been inserted at least 3.5 inches. In addition, the extent of rectal bleeding showed that she'd been alive at the time of the assault. Most revealing of all was the discovery of soot in the upper airway, indicating that she'd been alive when she was set on fire. Investigators questioned both Melinda Loveless and Lori Tackett before transporting them to the Indiana Circuit Court in Madison. A single count of murder was entered against both girls, and counsel was appointed to represent them. In a separate hearing, Judge Ted Todd waived both girls from the juvenile court system, determining that they'd be tried as adults. Following Loveless and Tackett's hearing, Prosecutor Guy Townsend spoke with Hope Rippey's attorney regarding her involvement. By this time, the media were swarming all over the case, and it was making national headlines. The public was in shock and demanded quick justice for Shanda. The media attention also brought forth several teens who knew the accused and felt they had interesting tidbits of information to contribute. Apparently, Loveless and Tackett had confessed to at least 3 people, 2 of whom swiftly made statements to Shipley and Henry. The facts were starting to fall into place, and investigators were slowly piecing together what had happened to Shanda. While each of the girls tried to play down her own role in the murder, most of their statements matched. Prosecutor Guy Townsend was confident. There was no way Shanda could be brought back, but he was determined that she get justice. A picture, based upon the girls' confessions, statements by witnesses, and evidence uncovered by investigators, was beginning to emerge of Shanda Scherer's last hours of life, which would make that possible. By the night of Friday, January 10th, 1992, Melinda Loveless had reached her breaking point. Her girlfriend, 14-year-old Amanda Heavrin, had been cheating on her with Shanda, and she was fed up. It was now time for her to show them just how serious she was. Lori Tackett was coming over, and Loveless knew that she'd be more than happy to help her put a plan into action. Loveless had always thought Tackett was strange because she dabbled in the occult and claimed to have another personality that was a vampire. But she was, after all, a devoted friend and had often talked about killing someone for the fun of it. Tackett picked up 2 of her friends on the way to Loveless's house, 15-year-olds Hope Rippey and Tony Lawrence. Lawrence had never met Loveless before, and Rippey had met her only once or twice herself. When the girls arrived at Loveless's, they went upstairs and began chit-chatting about what the night had in store. All of them had lied to their parents earlier that day, telling them they were spending the night at a friend's house. As the girls sat around talking, Loveless pulled a large kitchen knife out of her purse and said she was going to use it to scare someone. She then told Rippey and Lawrence about the problems she had been having with Shanda Scherer. Loveless obtained Scherer's address, and before long, the girls were en route to her house. They had a difficult time locating it, but after asking directions a few times, they eventually found it and parked half a block away. Since Rippey and Lawrence had never met Scherer, Loveless instructed them to go to the door, claiming to be friends of Amanda Heavrin. Loveless wanted the girls to lure Scherer out to her car. When the girls knocked on the door, Scherer answered. Lawrence and Rippey explained to her that they were friends of Heavrin and that she was waiting for her at a deserted stone building in the woods called the Witch's Castle. Scherer said she couldn't go then because her parents were up, but she told them she'd sneak out around midnight if they wanted to come back. Lawrence and Rippey agreed and headed back to the car. Loveless was angry that Scherer wasn't with them, but she calmed down when they told her about Scherer's plan. Since they had time to kill, the girls decided to go to a concert at a nearby state park. It was after 12:30 a.m. by the time the girls made their way back to Scherer's house. Lawrence didn't want to go back up to the door, so Rippey and Tackett agreed to go. Loveless was the only one of the bunch that Scherer knew, so she hid in the back seat under a blanket. Cher was waiting at the side door when Tackett and Rippy walked up. They explained that Hevron was still waiting for her and that she'd sent them back to pick her up. Cher was hesitant at first, but Rippy was able to convince her to go, and soon they were all getting into Tackett's car. Lawrence slid out of the front passenger seat so that Cher could sit in the middle, and they were on their way. Tackett explained to Cher that the witch's castle was a short drive away in Utica, and that it used to be the home of 9 witches who controlled the town. As they drove to the castle, Rippy asked Cher questions about Hevron and their relationship. Cher said that they'd been going out for quite a while and that she really cared about her. Suddenly, Lovelace popped her head from the back seat, grabbed Cher by the hair, and placed the knife to her throat. Cher cried and begged Lovelace not to hurt her, but for the remainder of the drive, Lovelace berated her and repeatedly referred to her as a bitch, all the while holding the knife tightly against her throat. Cher was sobbing uncontrollably by the time they reached the witch's castle. Lovelace and Tackett pulled her out of the car and held her arms tightly as Rippy and Lawrence illuminated the trail to the castle with lighters. Once inside, Lovelace tied Cher's hands as Rippy taunted her with the knife. Lovelace then took several pieces of Cher's jewelry, which she and Lawrence put on. Rippy decided she liked the musical Mickey Mouse watch Cher was wearing, so she took it for herself. It was dark in the castle, so Tackett took an old t-shirt and started a fire. As the flames grew, Tackett pointed at the fire and told Cher that that was what she was going to look like before the night was over. Cher was so frightened that she couldn't even speak. She just sobbed uncontrollably. Tackett was growing nervous as several cars drove by the castle and suggested they leave and go to another place by her house. So the girls dragged Cher back to the car and drove off with their prisoner. When the girls stopped at a 5-star station, Cher was stuffed behind the back seat and covered with a blanket as Lovelace stood guard. Tackett pumped gas while Rippy went inside to pay, and Lawrence made a phone call to a friend. During the conversation, Lawrence mentioned nothing of Cher being held captive. For someone who later claimed to be very distraught over the night's events, she made no attempt to seek help. As soon as Lawrence hung up the phone, the group hit the road again. It took nearly an hour for the girls to reach Madison. Tackett pointed out her house, and a few miles later, they pulled onto an old logging road and stopped. Rippy and Lawrence got out of the car, and Lovelace and Tackett yanked Cher from the back seat. Lovelace untied Cher's hands and ordered her to remove her clothes. It was bitterly cold, so Rippy and Lawrence got back in the car and took up positions next to the window to watch what happened. Cher stripped down to her panties as Lovelace threatened her with the knife. Lovelace then scooped up the clothes and threw them in the car, telling the others that she wanted them as souvenirs. Rippy picked up Cher's polka-dotted bra and put it on as Lawrence turned on the radio. Tackett grabbed both of Cher's hands and held them behind her back so that Lovelace could hit her. Cher begged them to let her go and swore to stay away from Hevron, but each plea was answered by Lovelace's command for her to shut up. Suddenly, Lovelace punched Cher as hard as she could in the stomach, and Cher collapsed to the ground. Through gasping breaths, Cher begged them to stop hurting her. Cher's cries fell upon deaf ears. Lovelace picked her up by the hair and repeatedly slammed Cher's head into Lovelace's knee. The multiple blows caused Cher's braces to cut into her lips, and blood flowed from her mouth. As Cher lay on the ground moaning, Lovelace pulled out the knife and tried to cut her throat, but it proved too dull to cut the skin. Rippy then jumped out of the car to help hold Cher down as Lovelace tried using her foot to force the knife, but again it failed to have any effect. Unable to slit Cher's throat, Lovelace and Tackett took turns stabbing her in the chest with the knife. The wounds weren't severe enough to cause immediate death, so Tackett decided that they'd have to strangle Cher and ran back to the car for a length of rope. Cher continued to beg for her life, but Lovelace simply laughed in her face. When Tackett returned with the rope, Lovelace sat on Cher's legs as Tackett straddled her chest. Tackett then wrapped the rope around Cher's neck and pulled with all of her might until Cher's body went limp. Uncertain if Cher was really dead, the girls tossed her body into the trunk and headed for Tackett's house. When the group got to Tackett's house, the girls went upstairs to her room, and Tackett pulled out some stones and tried reading their future. Just as Tackett said that their futures looked good, her dog began barking. When the girls listened out the window, they could hear Cher's muffled screams. Tackett ran to the kitchen, grabbed a paring knife, and ran outside. She threw open the trunk and, without warning, stabbed Cher multiple times, hoping to silence her. Finishing, Tackett closed the trunk and returned to her room, where the others were waiting. She was covered in blood. After a brief pause, Tackett announced that they needed to go for a ride. Rippy and Lawrence refused, so Loveless and Tackett left by themselves. As Loveless and Tackett drove around, deciding what to do next, they stopped to see whether Cher was dead. When the trunk lid opened, Cher sat up, covered in blood, with her eyes rolled back into her head. She tried to speak, but was only able to utter the word, "Mummy." Tackett then reached into the trunk, picked up a tire iron, and struck Cher on the head. She then closed the trunk, and they were on their way again. A short time later, as they traveled down winding back roads, they heard gurgling noises coming from the trunk. Tackett quickly pulled the car over to the side of the road to assess the situation. Loveless stayed inside while Tackett walked to the rear of the car and opened the trunk. Cher was lying on her side. She looked as though she'd been painted red, and strange gasping and gurgling noises were emanating from her chest wounds. Tackett grasped the tire iron again and brought it down hard on Cher's head several times. One of the blows was so severe that a chunk of Cher's skull broke off. Satisfied with her handiwork, Tackett shut the trunk and walked back to the front of the car. When she got inside, she placed the end of the tire iron under her nose and smelled it. She began laughing as she explained what had happened and waved the tire iron under Loveless's nose. The sun was starting to rise, so they decided to head back to Tackett's to burn Cher's body. Along the way, they stopped several times to try to quiet Cher with the tire iron. Back at Tackett's, the two girls woke up Rippy and Lawrence and bragged about the blows they'd inflicted upon Cher. Afterward, they explained their new plan, and Rippy and Lawrence followed them to Tackett's burn pile. The girls quickly discovered that their plan wouldn't work. The burn pile was covered in frost, and they didn't have any gasoline to start a fire. Instead, Tackett decided to show Rippy her handiwork. Lawrence didn't want to look at the body, so she was told to start the car and rev the engine if Cher started to scream. When Tackett opened the trunk, Rippy noticed a bottle of Windex next to Cher, so she picked it up and began spraying Cher with the cleaning liquid. As the Windex fizzled in her wounds, Cher somehow managed the strength to sit up. Her body was covered in blood, and her eyes were pure white. Cher began swaying back and forth as Tackett talked to her, but she said nothing in response. At some point about this time, the evidence suggests the girls sodomized Cher with a tire iron. However, none of them has ever admitted any knowledge of the wounds inflicted to her anal cavity. Tackett's mother then yelled out the door for her, causing Tackett to slam the trunk down on Cher's head. Once Tackett returned from the house, the girls decided it was time to end Cher's life once and for all. As the girls drove down the road, they again concluded that the best way to get rid of Cher was to burn her. Tackett pulled into the Clark Oil station north of Madison to fill up the gas tank and asked Lawrence to buy a 2-liter bottle of soda to fill with gas. Finishing their business at the gas station, the girls then drove out to Lemon Road. Rippy was familiar with the area and suggested that it would be a good spot to get rid of Cher. When they spotted an old logging road, they turned in and stopped the car. Tackett opened the trunk, and Loveless and Rippy helped her pick up Cher with the blanket with which they'd covered her earlier. Lawrence chose not to help and sat in the car watching as they carried Cher several feet behind the car before laying her on the ground. Rippy took the bottle of gasoline and poured a significant amount on Cher. Then Tackett struck a match and threw it down on Cher's gas-soaked body. The gasoline instantly ignited, and the fire appeared to be burning well. The girls hopped back into the car and began to pull away when Loveless became nervous and told Tackett to turn around. She wanted to make sure the body was burning. Back at the scene, Loveless grabbed the bottle with the remaining gasoline and ran over to Cher's body. She stood staring momentarily as Cher curled up into a fetal position and her tongue darted in and out of her mouth. After she felt as though she'd seen enough, she poured the remaining gasoline on Cher's smoldering corpse and ran back to the car. Loveless thought Cher's death throes were funny and described them to the others. Cher was finally out of Loveless's life for good. Tackett had seemed to enjoy herself during the crime, and Rippey and Lawrence must not have been too shaken up because they'd had several opportunities during the night to summon help for Cher, but they'd chosen not to. All of their exertions had tired them, so they stopped at a McDonald's on their way back. During breakfast, Tackett and Loveless joked several times about the resemblance of the sausages they were eating to Cher. Afterwards, Tackett drove Rippey and Lawrence to their homes and went with Loveless to her house. They decided earlier that Tackett would sleep over, but first they wanted to make some calls and brag about what they'd just done. It didn't take prosecutor Guy Townsend long to bring charges against Hope Rippey and Tony Lawrence. On March 15, 1992, he charged both girls with murder, arson, battery with a deadly weapon, aggravated battery, criminal confinement, and intimidation. During their arraignment, Judge Ted Todd waived both into the adult system. Following their brief appearance, they were taken to the Jefferson County Jail to await trial. Later that same afternoon, Melinda Loveless and Lori Tackett were brought before Judge Todd and charged with 7 additional crimes, including child molestation and criminal deviant conduct. A month later, on April 9, 1992, Townsend filed an additional count of felony murder against Loveless and Tackett. On April 22, 1992, Tony Lawrence accepted a plea deal with the state. In exchange for testimony against the other 3 girls and a guilty plea to the charge of criminal confinement, Townsend agreed to drop all the other charges against Lawrence. For this guilty plea, Lawrence would face 6 to 20 years behind bars at the sentencing judge's discretion. Many people were angry about the plea agreement, but Townsend felt it was necessary in order to have an eyewitness for the state. Unmoved by the state's new witness, Loveless, Rippey, and Tackett repeatedly turned down offers from the state. In response, Townsend filed death penalty specifications against Loveless and Tackett on July 13, 1992. In addition, he filed another charge against both girls, conspiracy to commit murder. Because of Rippey's age, Townsend could not file death penalty specifications against her. On August 17, 1992, Tony Lawrence was discovered slumped over in her cell. She was rushed to Scott Memorial Hospital in Scottsburg, where it was determined she'd taken an overdose of lorazepam, an antidepressant drug. It was later learned that she'd been saving her prescribed daily doses for some time in order to make a suicide attempt. Lawrence was initially comatose and remained in the intensive care unit for 11 days before regaining consciousness. Following her recovery, Judge Todd ordered that she be transferred to LifeSpring Mental Health Facility in Jeffersonville for evaluation. Lawrence remained in the custody of mental health officials until October 1992, when she was transferred back to jail. On September 21, 1992, Melinda Loveless and Lori Tackett decided to accept a plea bargain with the state. Both would plead guilty to the murder and torture of Shanda Scherer and to arson and criminal confinement. In exchange, the state would drop all other charges and withdraw the death penalty specifications against them. The agreement specified that they both cooperate with the state and that their ultimate sentences run concurrently. According to the book Cruel Sacrifice by Aphrodite Jones, just 8 days after her plea agreement, Melinda Loveless was caught having sex with an employee at the Clark County Jail. The employee subsequently resigned, and Loveless was transferred to the Indiana Women's Prison. No charges were filed. In November 1992, Tackett and Loveless attended separate plea agreement hearings in which they admitted to their actions in the death of Shanda Scherer. Judge Todd set both sentencing hearings for December 14, 1992. The following day, Hope Rippey's trial date was set for March 1, 1993. Regardless of her cronies' actions, she continued to maintain her innocence. During the first week of December 1992, Lori Tackett gave an exclusive interview to Chris Yaw, a reporter from WKRC TV in Cincinnati. During the 5-minute interview, Tackett repeatedly blamed Melinda Loveless for Shanda's death. "I didn't think she was going to go that far," Tackett said. "It wasn't really the fact that I can't believe I'm doing this. It was the fact that I can't believe this is happening. I told her it was stupid." Shanda hugged me. She asked me not to let Melinda do it. She was crying. There wasn't anything I could do. Tackett went on to say that she expected to beat the charges against her and that she planned on pursuing a degree in child psychology. On December 10, 1992, Judge Todd accepted Toni Lawrence's plea agreement in exchange for her full cooperation. Reporters from all over the United States were already making their way to Madison in anticipation of the girls' sentencing hearings. The age of innocence here ended at 10:45 a.m. last January the 11th on a dirt road 15 miles out of town, wrote Chicago Tribune reporter Ron Grossman. "It's like you look at the Leopold and Loeb case, recast it for girls, and set it in Main Street, USA," he added. On December 14, 1992, the opening day of the sentencing hearing for Melinda Loveless, television trucks lined the street outside the Jefferson County Courthouse. The courtroom was packed with reporters, onlookers, and family members from both sides. As the session began, Prosecutor Guy Townsend described to the court in vivid detail the events of Cher's abduction, torture, and murder. Over the next several days, Toni Lawrence, Lori Tackett, and several friends and acquaintances of Loveless were called to testify against her. Townsend also called Dawn and Ralph Foley, Sheriff Shipley, Detective Henry, Sergeant Wells, Dr. George Nichols, and several members of Cher's family. In the end, the most compelling and heart-wrenching testimony came from Shanda's mother, Jackie Vaught. She began with a video, which was a collection of photographs of Shanda at different stages of her life. As the tape played, Vaught narrated the photos. Following her presentation, she read a previously written statement to the courtroom running approximately 45 minutes. "It has obviously shattered all of our lives. I speak for all of us when I say I don't think there's anything worse than burying your own child. I can't control my emotions most of the time, and I cry because I want my baby back. I want her home for Christmas this year, but I can't have her. This year I didn't get to buy Shanda any presents. There are no presents for her under my tree. Melinda has cheated me out of being with my daughter during this life. It is my wish for you, Melinda, that you live your life with memories of her screams and the sight of her burned and mutilated body. I'm not sure who you love most in life, Melinda, whether it be your mother or your father, but I want you to imagine them in the trunk of that car. I want you to imagine the person you loved the most begging and screaming for their life. I want you to imagine that person being the person lying on the ground who is burned and mutilated. Maybe then, and I doubt this seriously, you could feel a small portion of the pain our family feels. The proper punishment for Melinda would be to place her in a cell with pictures of Shanda's burned body and force her to continuously listen to a tape of my daughter's screaming like she did that night. I hope and pray you remember these words for the rest of your life. May you rot in hell." At the conclusion of Vaught's testimony, Judge Todd announced that he'd wait until Lori Tackett's sentencing hearing to pronounce both girls' sentences. Lori Tackett's sentencing hearing began on December 28, 1992, and was almost identical to that of Melinda Loveless's. Townsend more or less recounted the same events, and the witnesses varied little. In addition, Loveless and Lawrence both testified as part of their plea agreement. On the morning of January 4, 1993, Melinda Loveless stood before Judge Todd awaiting her sentence. He began by citing all the factors involved in the case, including the gruesome nature of the crime and the victim's age. After a brief pause, Judge Todd sentenced Loveless to 60 years in prison, the maximum sentence allowed under the plea agreement. "You still have time to turn your life around and do something good and useful with your life after prison," Todd said as Loveless began weeping uncontrollably. "Shanda Scherer does not. I hope you take advantage of this opportunity." Melinda sobbed uncontrollably as she was led away, and Lori Tackett was brought in. The judge again cited the factors involved in the case and passed down an identical sentence. Tackett, stone-faced, didn't flinch during the proceeding. Just 2 days after the sentencing of Loveless and Tackett, Cher's parents filed a $1 billion lawsuit against all 4 girls. The suit was filed after a Louisville television station reported that Tackett was negotiating to sell her story to a movie production company and that Loveless was also considering various offers she'd received. Cher's parents never expected to collect any of the money and wanted to discourage the girls from profiting at their daughter's expense. That same day, Jackie Vaught gave a brief interview to the Courier-Journal. "It's appalling to think that they could profit from killing Shanda, but I can't say I was shocked to hear about their plans. I know the horrible things these girls are capable of," she said. Clark County Circuit Judge Daniel Donahue agreed with Jackie and quickly issued a temporary injunction blocking the girls from making any deals to sell their story. Despite Judge Donahue's injunction, Indiana law mandates that any money a felon receives for publication or broadcast rights be deposited in a violent crime victims fund. Hence, it was, and remains, highly unlikely that the girls would ever be able to profit from their crime. Tony Lawrence's sentencing hearing began on January 19, 1993. The hearing lasted a mere 2 days, during which time investigators praised Lawrence for her cooperation, and several teachers, family members, and friends testified on her behalf. Lawrence was also granted permission by the court to read a statement of her own to Cher's family. "I'm so sorry about your little girl. I know that you can never forgive me for being with those girls on January 10th and 11th, but I would like to explain some things to you. I do feel very much remorse for your daughter. I've been locked up for 10 months, and that time has been a living hell. I've had nightmares where I wake up screaming and can't stop to think for a second without seeing Shanda's burned body or hearing her screams. I was terrified of Melinda and Lori. Melinda had a knife and was going to kill Shanda. I know I should be punished, but in my heart, seeing Shanda tortured and burnt was punishment in itself. I didn't get help because I was scared they would kill me too. That night and morning will live visibly in my mind for the rest of my life. I know you have the right to hate me. I wish there was something I could do for you, but all I can say is how very sorry I am." Following Lawrence's statement, Jackie Vaught took the stand to give her reply. "I sat through 3 sentencing hearings and had to look and listen to my daughter's murderers day after day while they lied and put on acts worthy of an Oscar. I see attorneys trying to convince everyone that these girls are victims. The victim here is Shanda Renee Scherer and her family and friends. Tony could have saved my daughter's life that night at any given time. She chose not to." When court reconvened the following morning, Judge Todd sentenced Tony Lawrence to serve 20 years in prison, the maximum sentence allowed by law. Lawrence broke down and cried as deputies led her away. Hope Rippey ultimately accepted a plea deal as well, and her sentencing hearing began on June 1, 1993. At the request of the defense, the hearing was moved to South Bend, Indiana, and was held at St. Joseph Superior Courthouse with Judge Jeannie Jordan presiding. At the outset of the hearing, Rippey made a statement maintaining her claim that her only action against Shanda had been pouring the gasoline on her body. Following her brief statement, the defense called psychologist Michael Sheehan to the stand. Dr. Sheehan stated that Rippey was immature and had acted solely under the domination of Melinda Loveless and Lori Tackett. However, testimony by Lawrence, Loveless, and Tackett painted a different picture. The prosecution also called witnesses from the previous 3 proceedings. The last to testify was Cher's mother, Jackie Vaught. As she once again showed the video of Cher to the court, she became angry when Rippey held her head down. In response, Judge Jordan ordered Rippey to watch the presentation. Following the video, Vaught made a brief statement. "Imagine how you would feel if someone did to your niece what you did to our child. You cannot know the pain we've felt. There is no greater pain than losing your child." After a short recess, Judge Jordan sentenced Hope Rippey to the maximum sentence of 60 years, but suspended 10 years for mitigating circumstances, ordering her to be placed on probation for 10 years at the time of her release. Judge Jordan then made her own statement to the court. Hope Rippey had choices. There were avenues of escape, ways to help herself, ways to help Shanda. She poured the gasoline so no one would get caught, even though she knew it would kill Shanda. Her lack of mercy, of tender courage, is a horrifying lesson to us all. Following Rippey's sentencing, Jackie Vaught spoke to the press from the steps of the courthouse. I don't know what normal is anymore. I'm not the person I was when Shanda was here. I'm going home to my new grandbaby who is just born. You have to go on. Shanda's with God. In the spring of 1994, Toni Lawrence received her GED. 4 years later, on November 10, 1998, she was denied early release from prison. During 2000, she received an associate's degree, which reduced her prison sentence by nearly 1 year. In March 2000, Crime Library reporter David Lohr sent a letter to each of the convicted murderers asking for their opinion as to why someone would kill. Only 2 responded, Lori Tackett being the first. I've often wondered what motivates someone to commit murder myself. No murderer has the same motivations as all the rest, in my opinion. I also believe killers are really deep individuals who are searching for some kind of release. Whether it be mental, physical, or spiritual, it's always release. There's always a purpose for one's actions. There could be many reasons. Let's say, for instance, I know a couple of people who kill simply for the fear that they see in their victims' eyes and for the sight of blood on their bodies. My opinion is that they do it to feel superior or high on the victim's fear, and they're thirsty for the spill of blood. The only other reply came from Toni Lawrence. In some ways, her views were similar. I think the first time one kills, they kill to get that high that they could never obtain any other way. But it's a separate, more telling paragraph that catches the attention. So, you write Lori? How about Hope Melinda? I don't mind about Lori. Please tell her I think of her daily and that I'm okay. The above statement leads one to seriously question some of Toni's statements regarding her relationship with Lori and her participation in the murder of Shanda Sharer. It seems odd that someone would want to send best wishes to a person whom they claimed ruined her life by brutally murdering an innocent girl. Regardless of her level of guilt, on December 14, 2000, 24-year-old Toni Lawrence walked out of prison on parole after serving nearly 9 years of her 20-year sentence. Following her release, Lawrence spoke briefly with Louisville television station Wave before heading back to Madison with her parents. I didn't stop it. I couldn't stop it. I don't care what anyone else says. If I'd tried anything different, I would have been dead, lying there with her, and they would never know. Toni remained on parole until December 2002. On Saturday, April 21, 2001, 45-year-old reporter for the Courier-Journal, Michael Joseph Quinlan, author of Little Lost Angel, the true story of the teenage conspiracy to kill 12-year-old Shanda Sharer, died at his home in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky, from brain cancer. Following his death, Kathy Quinlan started the Michael Quinlan Brain Cancer Foundation. On November 3, 2004, Indiana Superior Court Judge Jenny Manier reduced Hope Rippey's prison sentence from 50 to 35 years. According to reports in the Courier-Journal, Judge Manier felt Rippey was remorseful and likely to be productive in society. In making her decision, Manier took into account Rippey's bachelor degree from a Ball State University General Studies program for inmates, along with the time she spent training seeing eye dogs and speaking to various youth groups. With the judge's decision affirmed, Hope Rippey's earliest possible release date was changed from 2017 to 2006. Sherer's mother, Jackie Vaught, was angered by the decision. She's taken every class, Vaught said. She's gotten every degree she can get, with my tax dollars, I might add. She's done everything she can to get out early, but it's just wrong. The only thing Vaught said she wanted was for Rippey and the others to serve their full sentences. While the news of Rippey's impending release was difficult for Shanda's family to understand, their anger would once again turn to sorrow when, on May 8, 2005, Shanda's father, 52-year-old Stephen Malloy Scherer, died. The cause of death has not been publicly released. However, it has been reported that he was buried in the same cemetery as his daughter. During the spring of 2006, the news spotlight momentarily switched from Hope Rippey to Lori Tackett. During the previous year, the Indiana Department of Corrections launched a program called PLUS in 3 of its state prisons. The program, which stands for Purposeful Living Unit Serve, is a faith-based boot camp for prisoners intended to change their lives through spiritual renewal and education. In March 2006, Indiana news station WTHR broadcast a report from inside the prison to see how well the program was working. Reporter Ann Ryder interviewed several inmates, including 31-year-old Lori Tackett. "I'm changing everything I have known all my life," Tackett said. "God was the last thing I wanted in my life. I had no faith in life. I had no faith in God. I had no faith in people. I had none of that. I had to fall on my face and start over." Tackett told Ryder that the shame of her crime defined her until she tried unsuccessfully to take her own life in the fall of 2004. It was then, she claims, that she felt God's love in her heart. "I took God's hand. I've never felt that before in my life." Regardless of whose hand Tackett felt soothing her, 6 months later, when the PLUS program came to the Indiana Women's Prison, she was one of the first to sign up. Tackett now supposedly spends her free time studying the Bible and coming to grips with the consequences of her crimes. "I don't think I've really forgiven myself. I feel that's a lifelong process. Hopefully by the time I die, I'll be able to do that," Tackett said. In a later interview with WTHR, when asked whether she could ever forgive Tackett, Jackie Vaught simply replied, "It's just not up to me to forgive those girls. It's up to God to forgive them." One must question why it is that Tackett suddenly embraced religion. It's certainly interesting how her conversion to God coincided with Rippey's sentence reduction. The Department of Corrections Commissioner and others are quick to defend the PLUS program, and that's fine. It may work for some inmates. However, Lori Tackett's sudden conversion may well have more to do with her own hopes for early release than it does with finding God. As Tackett tried to map out her own road to freedom, Rippey was busy packing her bags, and on April 28, 2006, 29-year-old Hope Ann Rippey walked out of Indiana Women's Prison on parole after serving 14 years of her original 50-year sentence. "She tortured her," Scherer's mother, Jackie Vaught, told the Courier-General. "She tortured her for 10 hours. I do not accept this," she said. "She murdered my daughter. I'm just incensed by the release," Vaught said. Vaught then reminded reporters how Rippey lured Scherer out of the house, held her down while she was stabbed and strangled, sprayed window cleaner into her wounds, and poured gasoline on her so the group could burn her alive. According to Scherer's mother, Rippey's early release was made possible because the St. Joseph County prosecutor failed to do his job. Vaught was adamant that they could have prevented Rippey's sentence reduction if they'd chosen to oppose the sentence modification motion back in 2004. "She poured gasoline on my 12-year-old child and burned her alive. But she's an asset to society and has strong convictions and is ethical? I don't get it," Vaught said. "I just don't get it." Regardless of who's right and who's wrong, once again, a brutal killer was free to roam the streets of Jefferson County, Indiana. Hope Rippey will be required to report to probation officials there. However, she'll be under supervision for only the next 5 years. Shanda Scherer's mother, Jackie Vaught, believes Melinda Loveless holds the most responsibility for her daughter's murder. In an October 2007 interview with Wave3.com, Jackie said, "Melinda is, of the 4 girls, she's just evil. If it wasn't for her, Shanda would still be alive. She's the one who started it all. She brutally murdered my child, and when I say brutal, it was brutal. There were 10 hours of torture." Jackie also disagrees with statements by Small that Melinda Loveless was remorseful for her crimes. I've heard from people who have been in that prison, Jackie said. They seem to want to contact me, and I've heard things about Melinda, and Melinda relishes the fact that she is Shanda's murderer. She is very proud of that. After reading a series of news articles published by Crime Library on the Shanda Sharer case, Brenda Nyberg, a reader from Illinois, took action and started a petition to keep Loveless behind bars. I've never been compelled to start a petition until I read about Loveless trying to get out, Nyberg said. I can't fathom a human being inflicting the torture those girls did on Shanda. I'm a crime buff and read about so many horrible cases, but none has ever affected me as this one has. I just can't get the images of that child out of my head. It's pure evil, no matter how old those girls were. By December 2, 2007, the petition had received nearly 7,000 signatures. Melinda Loveless's hearing was held on December 6, 2007. During the proceedings, Loveless told Jefferson Circuit Judge Ted Todd that she couldn't remember most of the legal proceedings that had taken place before she signed her original plea deal, but that it had been her belief that she'd receive the death sentence if she failed to accept it. In October 2007, Loveless's lawyer, Mark Small, called for a hearing to make a case for his client's release. He claimed Loveless was deeply harmed by abuse she suffered as a child. He also stated she had poor legal help during her sentencing, which led her to take a plea deal because she was wrongly told she might get the death penalty. Small further mentioned that Loveless, just 16 at the time of her plea deal, was too young to make such a legal deal in Indiana without a parent's or guardian's okay, which she didn't have. If the judge bought these arguments, Loveless could have faced a new trial or been set free. On January 8, 2008, Judge Ted Todd turned down Loveless's request. She would instead be up for parole after 15 years, sticking to the initial guilty plea. On November 14, 2008, the Indiana Court of Appeals also said no to Loveless's appeal, agreeing with Judge Todd's decision. Small said he'd try to take the case to the Indiana Supreme Court. Lawrence got out on December 14, 2000, after 9 years behind bars, and was on parole until December 2002. Rippey was let out on parole from Indiana Women's Prison on April 28, 2006, after doing 14 years of her sentence. She stayed under parole watch for 5 more years until April 2011. Tackett walked out of Rockville Correctional Facility on January 11, 2018, exactly 26 years after Scherer's death, having served almost 26 years. She finished another year on parole. Loveless got out of Indiana Women's Prison on September 5, 2019. After more than 26 years in jail, she's now on parole in Jefferson County, Kentucky. In an interview with Shanda Scherer's mother, Jackie Vaught, on the investigation discovery series Deadly Women, Vaught stated that Scherer's father was so distraught by his daughter's murder that he did everything he could to kill himself besides put a gun to his head, and that he drank himself to death. The man definitely died from a broken heart.